The soft morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the quiet bedroom. The world outside was alive. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, children's laughter carried through the air. But inside this room, silence ruled. 17-year-old Emily Carter sat in her wheelchair, staring blankly out the window. 2 years had passed since the accident, a freak car crash that stole more than just her ability to walk. It had stripped away her freedom, her dreams, and the fire in her eyes. Her father, Daniel Carter, stood by the door, watching her. He barely recognized the daughter who once ran across soccer fields with boundless energy. Now she barely spoke. She barely moved. And what crushed him the most, she barely looked at him anymore. Daniel had tried everything: therapy, motivational books, even moving to a quieter town, hoping a fresh start would help. Nothing worked. Emily had built walls around herself, and no matter what he did, she wouldn't let him in. But today, Daniel had a different plan. One last attempt to bring her back to life. He stepped into the room, holding a small bundle of fur in his arms. The golden retriever puppy wiggled restlessly, its tiny tail wagging like it carried a secret joy the world hadn't discovered yet. Emily barely turned her head. "What's that?" she asked, her voice flat. Daniel swallowed, forcing a smile. "His name is Charlie. I got him from the shelter." He set the puppy down gently on her lap. The moment Charlie's warm body settled against her legs, something changed. Emily tensed, not because she was excited, but because she was feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Heat. Pressure. She quickly shook it off. It had to be in her head. Charlie licked her hand and let out a soft whimper. His big brown eyes locked onto hers, filled with something almost knowing. Emily's fingers twitched as she hesitantly ran them through his soft fur. It was the smallest movement, barely anything at all, but Daniel caught it. Hope. A tiny spark of hope. Emily looked down at the puppy, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt something shift inside her. Something she didn't understand. She didn't know it yet, but this little dog was about to change everything. Emily's fingers lingered in the soft fur of the golden retriever pup, her mind caught between curiosity and indifference. The last thing she needed was another reminder of what she couldn't do. She didn't want responsibility, didn't want hope, because hope had betrayed her before. Her father, Daniel, watched with cautious optimism. It had been 2 years of watching his daughter disappear inside herself. 2 years of one-sided conversations, of cold, empty silences. She wasn't just paralyzed in body. She was paralyzed in spirit. He had seen the way she used to be. Before the accident, Emily was unstoppable, fiercely independent, always on the move. Soccer practice, late-night study sessions, weekend hikes. It was exhausting keeping up with her, but he wouldn't have changed a second of it. Then, in a blink, it was gone. The accident was brutal. A rainy night, a slippery road, a moment's loss of control. Emily had been in the passenger seat, singing along to the radio, laughing. Then, suddenly, there was impact, glass shattering, tires screeching, metal twisting, and silence. She had woken up in a hospital bed with no feeling in her legs, and a doctor explaining what she refused to believe. "The damage to your spine is severe," they had said. "There's a chance you may never walk again." Daniel had been there through every painful second, through the nights she screamed at the ceiling, through the months of physical therapy that led nowhere. He had been her rock, even when she pushed him away. And she had pushed him away. "Dad," Emily muttered, pulling him from his thoughts. She looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. "Why did you bring him here?" Daniel sighed, pulling up a chair beside her. "Because I can't stand watching you give up." Emily's jaw tightened. "I didn't give up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't see the point." She expected him to argue, to tell her that life was still worth living, that she could still find happiness, that she could still be someone. She was tired of those speeches. But Daniel didn't argue. He just looked at her, his eyes heavy with something even stronger than sadness, determination. "I don't know if Charlie will change anything," he admitted, "but I had to try." Charlie, who had been quietly curled against Emily, suddenly lifted his head, his ears perking up. He looked up at her with those big, intelligent eyes, then did something strange. He placed his tiny paw right on her leg. Emily gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She felt that. It wasn't much, just a whisper of sensation, like the faintest pressure. But it was there. She stared down at the puppy, heart pounding. That had to be in her head. Emily. Daniel's voice was cautious. What is it? She hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing, she muttered, looking away. She wouldn't say it, wouldn't even entertain the thought, because getting her hopes up was dangerous. But deep inside, a seed had been planted. Charlie wasn't just any dog, and she was about to find out why. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. Silent meals, quiet evenings, and the occasional glance from Emily that made Daniel wonder if something had changed. She never mentioned what had happened the first time Charlie placed his paw on her leg. She refused to acknowledge it, refused to even think about it, because if it wasn't real, she couldn't afford to believe in it. But something was different. She still spent hours staring out the window, still ignored phone calls from old friends, still rejected every attempt at therapy. But at night, when she thought no one was watching, she let Charlie curl up beside her, and that was progress. Daniel didn't push. He had learned the hard way that forcing hope on someone who wasn't ready for it only made them run further away. Instead, he let Charlie do what he seemed to do best, exist in the spaces where words failed. But then something happened that neither of them could ignore. It was late, the house bathed in moonlight and shadow. Emily had fallen asleep in her wheelchair near the window. Charlie curled at her feet. The steady rhythm of the clock ticked away the hours when suddenly, Charlie shot up, ears alert, body tense. Then he barked, not the playful yelp of excitement or the whining cry of hunger. This was sharp, urgent. Emily stirred, groggy and confused. Charlie, she murmured, rubbing her eyes. Charlie wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the corner of the room, body rigid, tail stiff. A chill ran down Emily's spine. Dad, she called, her voice uncertain. Footsteps pounded down the hall, and seconds later, Daniel burst in. What's wrong? His eyes flicked between Emily and Charlie. Charlie didn't stop barking. Emily's heart pounded against her ribs. There was nothing there. No movement. No sound. Just an empty room. But Charlie saw something. Daniel flipped on the light, scanning the space. What is it, boy? Charlie suddenly leapt off Emily's lap and bolted toward her nightstand. He pawed at it, growling low in his throat. Emily frowned, her fingers curling around the armrest of her wheelchair. What's he doing? Daniel moved toward the nightstand, hesitating before pulling open the drawer. He rifled through it, and then froze. His stomach twisted as he pulled out the prescription bottle. Painkillers. Leftover from the accident. Emily's face drained of color. She hadn't touched them. Not in months. She didn't even remember they were still there. But seeing them now, she knew what Charlie had sensed. She had spent the last 2 years pretending she didn't feel anything. Not sadness, not anger, not grief. But deep down, buried beneath every forced smile and hollow "I'm fine," was something darker. Something Charlie had pulled into the light. Daniel tightened his grip on the bottle. Emily. His voice was careful, cautious. She swallowed hard, her hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. I wasn't, she stopped. Looked away. Charlie whimpered, nudging her leg with his nose. And just like that, she broke. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, her breath shuddering. I don't know how to do this, Dad. Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. I don't know how to be me anymore. Daniel knelt beside her, setting the bottle aside. His hands rested over hers, steady and warm. You don't have to figure it all out today, he said. But you don't have to do it alone either. Charlie nudged her again, soft and insistent. A silent promise that he wasn't going anywhere. Emily looked down at him, the weight in her chest shifting. Not gone, but different. For the first time, she didn't feel completely lost. But none of them knew that this was just the beginning, because Charlie wasn't done changing her life yet. And what he did next, even science wouldn't be able to explain. The next morning, Emily awoke with a strange heaviness in her chest. Last night had changed something. She wasn't sure what, but she could feel it, like an old wound that had been hidden for too long, now raw and exposed. Charlie lay curled at her feet, his golden fur rising and falling with each slow breath. Had he really sensed what she was feeling last night? Could a dog even do that? She shook the thought away. It was just instinct, nothing more. Yet, when she reached down to scratch his ears, he stirred, his big brown eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart clench. "I'm okay," she murmured, even though she wasn't sure if it was true. Charlie huffed, unconvinced. Downstairs, Daniel was already in the kitchen, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the stove. The smell of cinnamon and brown sugar filled the air, but Emily barely noticed as she wheeled herself in. "Morning, kiddo," Daniel greeted, forcing a smile. He was trying to act normal, but she could see it in his face. He was worried about her. Emily hated that. She didn't want to be someone people tiptoed around. She didn't want to be the fragile girl who made her father's smile look forced. So, she did what she always did. She pretended nothing was wrong. "Morning," she muttered, grabbing a spoon and taking a small bite of oatmeal. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "I was thinking," he started, choosing his words slowly. "Maybe we should take Charlie to the vet, just to check in, see if he's healthy." Emily's eyes narrowed. "What? He's fine." Daniel hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Last night it was strange, Em. The way he reacted. The way he stopped, shaking his head. I just think it wouldn't hurt to get him checked out." Emily bristled. She knew what this was. He wanted to talk to a vet because he thought Charlie was some kind of therapy dog, a trained emotional support animal who had just happened to end up in their lives. But he wasn't. Charlie wasn't trained. He wasn't special. He was just a dog. And yet, Emily remembered the way she had felt when his paw touched her leg. That flicker of something. That impossible, fleeting moment. "Fine," she said, pushing her oatmeal aside. "Let's go." At the vet's office, the small clinic smelled like antiseptic and fur, a strange but familiar mix. As they sat in the waiting room, Charlie rested his head on Emily's lap, tail thumping lazily against her wheelchair. Daniel filled out the paperwork while Emily absent-mindedly ran her fingers through Charlie's fur. She wasn't sure why she suddenly felt anxious. A few minutes later, a woman in a white coat stepped out. Dr. Evelyn Marsh. Her name tag read. She was in her 40s, with a warm but calculating gaze. "Charlie, huh?" she said, kneeling to scratch under his chin. "Let's see what we've got here." Inside the exam room, Dr. Marsh ran through the usual checks: ears, eyes, heartbeat. "He's in great shape," she said, flipping through her notes. Emily exhaled. "Of course he is." But then something happened. Dr. Marsh reached for Charlie's paws, feeling along his legs and joints. The moment she touched his front paw, he flinched. Emily stiffened. "What's wrong?" Dr. Marsh frowned, her fingers moving more delicately now. "There's some unusual tension here," she murmured. "Like he's sensitive." Daniel leaned forward. "Sensitive how?" The vet hesitated. "It's hard to say. Some dogs are more attuned to physical responses than others. Therapy dogs, for example, are trained to recognize emotional distress in humans. But Charlie," she paused, her brow furrowing. "It's almost like he's picking up on something." Emily's heart pounded. She didn't like where this was going. Dr. Marsh glanced between them. "Has he ever reacted to anything unusual? Changes in behavior, heightened alertness?" Daniel and Emily exchanged glances. Daniel started, but Emily cut him off. "He's fine," she said firmly, gripping Charlie's collar. "Can we go now?" Dr. Marsh hesitated, clearly sensing the tension in the room. But she nodded. "Of course. Just if you notice anything else, let me know." As they left the office, Emily's mind raced. She didn't believe in miracles. She didn't believe in fate. But Charlie wasn't normal. And soon, she wouldn't be able to ignore it anymore. The ride home was silent. Emily stared out the window, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking Charlie's fur. She wanted to forget what the vet had said, wanted to convince herself that Charlie was just a normal dog, that there was nothing special about him. But she couldn't, because deep down she knew Something about Charlie wasn't normal. Daniel cleared his throat, glancing at her from the driver's seat. "Emily, I think we should talk about what happened." She didn't respond. Dr. Marsh wasn't saying anything crazy. He continued carefully. "Charlie reacts to things. To you. And that's not a bad thing." Emily clenched her jaw. "I don't want to talk about it." Daniel sighed. He knew that tone. The wall was back up. By the time they pulled into the driveway, Emily felt suffocated. As soon as Daniel parked, she wheeled herself out and headed for the house, Charlie padding silently behind her. She didn't stop until she was back in her room. The moment she shut the door, Charlie let out a low whimper. Emily turned to him, frustrated. "What?" she snapped, harsher than she meant to. Charlie just stared at her. Not with fear, not with hurt, but with understanding. Emily exhaled sharply, raking a hand through her hair. "You're not magic, okay?" Her voice wavered. "You're just a dog." Charlie took a step forward and gently placed his paw on her leg. A shock ran through her. Not pain, not discomfort, something else. It was subtle, like a flicker of electricity beneath her skin. A faint tingling. Emily's breath caught. No, it wasn't real. But then she moved. Her toe. Just the tiniest twitch. Her stomach dropped. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She shoved Charlie's paw off her leg, her hand shaking. It wasn't possible. Her heart pounded as she stared down at her legs, waiting, begging them to move again. But nothing happened. It had to be in her head. Charlie sat beside her, tail wagging ever so slightly, as if he knew something she didn't. A knock on the door made her flinch. "Emily." Daniel's voice was soft. "Everything okay?" She opened her mouth, to tell him, to scream, to demand an answer. But no words came out. She glanced at Charlie, at the unwavering warmth in his eyes. Then she swallowed hard and whispered, "I'm fine." Because she needed to know for herself first. Because if this was real, if something impossible was happening, she wasn't ready for the truth. Not yet, but soon. She wouldn't have a choice. The world felt different. For 2 years, Emily had lived in a prison of stillness, her legs nothing more than lifeless weight beneath her. She had accepted it, forced herself to accept it. But now that acceptance was crumbling, because last night, her toe had moved. She had seen it, felt it. It wasn't her imagination. And the worst part, Charlie knew. Now, as she sat in her wheelchair by the window, staring at the golden retriever curled at her feet, her mind raced with questions she couldn't ignore. Why now? Why him? She wanted to believe it was just coincidence, a misfire in her nerves, a trick of the mind. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Something about Charlie was different, and whether she was ready or not, she was about to find out why. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body tense with anticipation. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Another flicker of movement, another sign. Then, just as she was about to close her eyes, Charlie shot up. His ears perked. His body stiffened. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Emily's heart pounded. "Charlie," she whispered. He didn't look at her. He was staring at the door. Then, before she could react, he bolted off the bed and ran out of the room. Emily's pulse skyrocketed. Footsteps. Fast. Heavy. "Dad," she called out, panic creeping into her voice. Then a crash. Emily flinched. Something was happening downstairs. Adrenaline coursed through her, and without thinking, she reached for her wheelchair. But as she tried to move, her foot twitched. Again, she gasped. It was real, but there was no time to process it, because her father was in danger. Charlie's barks turned frantic. There was a struggle, the sound of furniture scraping against the floor. A deep, unfamiliar voice cursed under its breath. Emily's body trembled. "Dad!" Another crash. The sound of something, someone, slamming into the wall. Fear choked her, but something stronger pushed through. Move! The thought wasn't just in her mind. It was in her bones. Move! Something inside her snapped. And suddenly, her legs burned. It wasn't pain. It wasn't discomfort. It was feeling. Her breath hitched. She clenched her fists, gritted her teeth, and did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She tried to stand. The first attempt failed. Her arms shook, her muscles weak from years of disuse. But she tried again. And this time, she lifted herself. Her knees buckled. The weight of her own body was too much. But she didn't care, because she was standing. "Dad!" she screamed, gripping the doorframe for support. Then, summoning every ounce of strength left in her, she took a step. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't steady. But it was real. And she was going downstairs, because Charlie had led her to this moment. And now, she was going to save them both. Emily's legs trembled beneath her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every shaky step sent fire through muscles that hadn't worked in years, but the sounds from downstairs, ***, the struggle, the grunts, the barking, ***, kept her moving. Her father needed her. Charlie needed her. As she reached the top of the staircase, she gripped the railing, her breath ragged. She hadn't walked this far in 2 years. And now, she was about to do the impossible. Her grip tightened. Her knees shook. The stairs stretched before her like a mountain she had no business climbing. But fear, ***, real, raw fear for her father's life, ***, drowned out every doubt. She took the first step. Her body swayed. She clutched the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. But she stayed upright. One step, then another. Below, she could see them. Daniel was on the ground, his back against the wall, blood trickling from his temple. A man loomed over him, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured. Charlie was snarling, snapping at the intruder's legs, keeping him from getting closer to Daniel. But the man kicked Charlie hard, sending him yelping across the floor. Emily's vision blurred with rage. She forgot about the pain. She forgot about the fear. All she knew was that she had to get down there. Now, the last few steps were a blur. She half stumbled, half fell, but she didn't stop. The intruder turned, startled by the sudden movement. His eyes went wide. Emily didn't give him time to react. She threw herself at him. Her weak legs buckled, but momentum carried her forward. Her hand slammed into his chest, and together, they crashed to the ground. The man let out a strangled curse, scrambling to get up. But Charlie was faster. With a furious snarl, the golden retriever launched at him, sinking his teeth into the man's arm. The intruder screamed. Daniel, finally regaining his bearings, lunged forward, grabbing the fallen lab beside him. With all his strength, he swung. The room filled with a sickening crack. The man went limp. Silence. Emily collapsed to the floor, her chest heaving. Charlie rushed to her, whimpering, licking her face. She let out a breathless laugh, wrapping her arms around him. Her father was suddenly there, his hands gripping her shoulders, his voice shaking. Emily, you're standing. You walked. She blinked up at him, her mind still spinning. She had walked. The truth hit her all at once. Charlie had led her here, and for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't broken anymore. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, broken glass scattered across the floor, and in the center of it all, the man who had tried to hurt them lay unconscious. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling as the reality of what had just happened crashed down on her. She had walked. The thought pulsed through her like an electric current, overriding the exhaustion, the pain, the overwhelming impossibility of it all. Charlie sat beside her, his tail wagging, his tongue lolling out as if this was just another normal day, as if he hadn't just helped her achieve the one thing doctors said would never happen. Dad, Emily rasped, her voice hoarse. I don't understand. Daniel knelt in front of her, his hands shaking as he cupped her face. His eyes were filled with something Emily had rarely seen in them these past 2 years, pure, unfiltered joy. I don't either, he admitted. But you did it, Emily. You stood up. You walked. She swallowed, glancing down at her legs as if they belonged to someone else. Her jeans were rumpled, her knees bruised from the fall, but she could still feel them. The sensation wasn't gone. She wiggled her toes. Her breath hitched. It was real. A groggy groan from the intruder, snapped both Emily and Daniel back to the moment. Daniel's expression darkened. He grabbed his phone, quickly dialing 911. "We need the police," he said firmly, his other hand pressing against a fresh bruise forming on his ribs. "Someone broke into our house." Charlie let out a low growl, standing protectively in front of Emily, as if daring the man to try something. Minutes passed in a blur, sirens, flashing lights, uniformed officers asking questions. The intruder was handcuffed and dragged to his feet, his dazed protests falling on deaf ears. Emily barely heard a word. Her mind was spinning, replaying the moment her foot had moved, the surge of something that had propelled her forward. It wasn't just adrenaline. It wasn't a fluke. Charlie had done something. Later that night, the house had finally settled. The mess was still there, but the fear was gone. Emily sat on the couch, her legs curled up beneath her. No wheelchair. It still felt unreal. Daniel sat beside her, his arm wrapped in a bandage, exhaustion written all over his face. Charlie lay at their feet, his eyes fluttering open and shut, as if he were finally letting himself rest. Emily exhaled. "I don't know how to explain it," she admitted. "I should have fallen. I should have," she shook her head. "But it was like Charlie knew, like he was pushing me forward." Daniel ran a hand over his face. "I don't think it was just in your head, sweetheart." Emily frowned. "You don't?" He reached for his phone and, after a moment of hesitation, pulled up Dr. Marsh's number. She picked up on the third ring. "Daniel, is everything okay?" Daniel glanced at Emily. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think you need to see this." The next day, at Dr. Marsh's office, Emily sat stiffly in the examination chair, heart hammering as Dr. Marsh ran a series of tests. Pokes, prods, nerve scans. "Try to move your right foot," the doctor instructed. Emily hesitated, then did exactly that. The movement was small, barely anything at all, but it was there. Dr. Marsh's face remained unreadable as she scribbled notes. "This is," she exhaled, "incredible." Emily bit her lip. "So what does it mean?" The doctor looked between her and Daniel, then down at Charlie, who sat patiently beside her chair. "It means," she said carefully, "that something has changed." She leaned forward, hands clasped. "Emily, your spinal damage was severe. The chance of natural recovery was almost non-existent." Daniel tensed. "But," Dr. Marsh shook her head, "but your nerves are responding. They're firing again. Something has triggered a chain reaction." Emily's stomach twisted. "You're saying this shouldn't be possible?" The doctor smiled faintly. "I'm saying I have no scientific explanation for it." She turned her gaze toward Charlie. "But I think we both know where to start looking." Emily's breath hitched. Charlie. It was always Charlie. The way he had reacted to her pain before she even felt it. The way he had nudged her legs every night, pressing into the exact places she needed sensation. The way he had pushed her literally, until she moved. Tears burned in Emily's eyes as she reached down and ran her fingers through his golden fur. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. Charlie thumped his tail once, and in that moment, she realized, he always had. The drive home was quiet, but not the heavy kind of silence that had once filled their car. This was different, lighter, hopeful. Emily kept glancing at Charlie, who sat in the back seat, staring out the window with his tongue lolling happily. He had no idea how much he had changed her life. Or maybe he did. She flexed her toes inside her sneakers, just because she could. It was still weak, unsteady, but it was real. Daniel glanced at her as he pulled into the driveway. "So," he said carefully, "what now?" Emily exhaled, gripping the armrest of the door. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of that question. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I want to try." Daniel smiled, his eyes shining. "That's all I ever wanted to hear." 1 month later, Emily stood at the edge of the backyard, hands gripping the handles of the walker. Charlie stood beside her, tail wagging, waiting. Always waiting. She inhaled deeply. No more fear. No more excuses. One step. It was shaky, her legs wobbly beneath her, but she didn't stop. Another step. Charlie let out an excited bark, bouncing alongside her, as if celebrating every inch she moved. Emily laughed, really laughed. And for the first time, she didn't feel broken. She felt whole. She looked toward the porch, where Daniel stood watching, his hands pressed to his mouth, his expression unreadable. But she knew what he was feeling, because she felt it too. Charlie had given her something that no doctor, no medicine, no therapy had ever been able to. Belief. Belief that she wasn't trapped, that she could fight, that she could live. And because of him, she was walking again. Final scene that evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily sat on the porch steps, no wheelchair in sight. Charlie rested beside her, his head in her lap, the steady rise and fall of his breath soothing. She ran her fingers through his fur, her heart full. "I don't know what you are," she whispered, "but you saved me." Charlie let out a contented sigh. Daniel stepped outside, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. He handed one to Emily and sat beside her. "You know," he said, staring out at the sky, "some things in life don't need an explanation." Emily smiled, taking a sip. For the first time, she agreed. Because Charlie wasn't just a dog. He was a miracle, and he had given her life back.